Edgar, have people come into the room? I haven't looked at the participants,
Yeah, we have 13
attendees.
attendees.
Okay. I think that'll work for us. I don't know if we'll get any higher than that. Welcome to our February CAP meeting. I'm David McNeil. I'm co-facilitating with our friend John Keekley, who's on the road at the moment, but he's joined us, but his Wi-Fi is not 100%, so he's gonna lay low unless I mess something up really bad. This is a call to order for the meeting. We have an approved agenda. If anybody has any problems with the agenda, please let me know, and I'm gonna go out of order. We're gonna be opening with item F, but if there's any problems or changes to the agenda, please speak now. If you're unmuted, good. If you're not muted, if you're trying to unmute and say something. If not, we'll proceed with the item. Today's first item is going to be item F, which is the open discussion on the CSD, but a focus on a presentation by the Department of Public Health CAP Health Assessment Working Group. They're going to present to you, and I'm going to turn it over to our member, Sonia Vasquez, who will introduce the Public Health Department and the committee.
Thank you, everyone. For those of you in the audience that don't know me, my name is Sonia Vasquez. I work for an organization called Community Health Councils that's located in South Los Angeles. Our organization has been a part of this effort since 2008, probably earlier than that. And while my role at CHC was not on this project, I feel like I've been a part of this since then because of all that I've learned over the time that I've joined the CAP. I know it feels like, and it has been a while that we have been working on getting the health assessment and environmental justice study going. And believe me, there's still more to do. But we are super excited that we are at this point and we'll be able to present to you all what's been going on with the steering committee, getting the study ready to go live. And there's a lot that has been done, and we're really excited to share all that with you all. We thought that the pandemic was going to really put us behind, and it did a little bit, but not as badly as we had anticipated it might. So without further ado, I'm going to let Christine DeRosa, who is from the Division of Environmental Health, Toxicology, and Environmental Assessment from DPH, share with you this amazing work. Go ahead, Christine.
Thank you, Sonia. Edgar, I just want to confirm that everybody is unmuted who is an author on this.
Yes, everyone should be on here. The only one I don't see is Paul logged on, so he's
okay.
Only one.
If he does log on, yeah, I'd like him to be unmuted if possible.
We'll do. I'll keep a lookout.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. So this presentation is to talk about the plans for the health assessment. And I want to start by acknowledging the co-authors of this report, who are Erica Blyther, Paul Ferrazzi, Liz Gosnell, Charles McCaw, and Melanie Duran Traxler, who participated fully in the development of this. And also I want to thank Sonia Vasquez for facilitating all the health working group meetings forever, and to Community Health Councils for allowing us space to hold steering committee meetings. And this is a presentation that could go on for a very long time. We could talk about this for hours, and nobody wants that. So I'm going to try and squeeze it into 15 minutes, which means that I'm going to probably miss some things or maybe go too fast on a couple things, but we'll try and catch up at the end with some Q&A time. Okay, next slide, please. Edgar, that's you. Okay, while Edgar's trying to get that, there it is, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna provide an overview. I'm gonna provide an overview to explain the decisions that were made to design the health assessment that's now in the bidding process. And then I wanna provide some information on the bidding process itself, and then I will take some questions. Next slide, please. So if you recall, back in April 2018, the CAP sent a letter to DPH saying, please get started on the study, on the health assessment. And the CAP made recommendations for the second assessment, including things like paying better attention to length of residency, length of time in residence, and the communities most likely to be impacted, identifying which ones were more likely to be impacted, looking at environmental justice issues, testing for disproportionate impact, things like that. Also being very clear about the health outcomes that were selected and why, addressing short and long-term health outcomes, and then really engaging the community in the process. And so these recommendations served as guideposts for developing the plan for the assessment, and they helped us to kind of stay focused on community needs and expectations. Next slide, please. And now I'm afraid this is probably too small to see on your screen, but the reason I put this up is it's a document that a lot of us are familiar with. It's basically, each box is kind of a step of things that we needed to do. And the top row was the formative phase, that's blue. The scoping phase is the one that we just finished and that we're talking about tonight. That's in green. And then the implementation and analysis phase is the one at the bottom in orange. So if you recall, in the formative phase, we met with the health working group, we did a survey of the CAP. We've reviewed studies that had been done since the first assessment that was done to look at the methodology and get a sense of what the latest types of techniques are to do that. And then we developed the overall 3-phase plan that you're looking at, ran it by the CAP, and prepared to move on to the second phase. So at the second phase was the scoping phase. We convened a steering committee, and that committee was to make decisions on the health assessment design. And then at the end of that phase, so we went through steering committee meetings, and then we drafted documents, reviewed documents, and at the very end, we ended up with a solicitation that we could release for contractors to bid on the third phase of the study. So that's where we are. That's what that arrow says right there. We actually have released a work order solicitation to the contractors on a master list, and we released that on the 3rd. Then they will carry out everything that's on the bottom line there. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So now I'm going to talk in detail about that second middle phase there. So to start the process of, well, it's kind of to walk us through that whole process and to set up our steering committee, facilitate the preparation of the documents, review the documents that needed to be done. We hired a contractor, Burns and McDonnell, and we hired them to support the scoping phase, but with special attention to the community engagement piece. And the community engagement piece was actually the steering committee, which had a bunch of community members on it. And the reason that we wanted to do this, that we wanted to hire an independent organization, was kind of to level the playing field. So to make public health one of the participants in this process, along with the community members and the others that were involved in the steering committee, and I'll go over that in a second. The contractor also was able to bring on the consultants, which was much harder for public health to do. Yeah, so, and Sonia is letting you know that all these documents are actually online, and it's in much more detail online. So I'm just kind of going over it. So you can go to the next slide, please, Edgar. So our main goal in having an independent facilitator was to make sure that the community's concerns and voices were elevated in making decisions about the assessment. So the project management lead and the meeting facilitator was a woman named Jennifer Trotter, who had extensive expertise in public participation. She worked for Burns and McDonnell. She's with a different company now, but her expertise is about bringing in community voices into public agency decision making. So it was really very key to have that kind of expertise in a facilitator. And it ensured that, different perspective and experiences were incorporated. So she interviewed all the steering committee members, and I believe she also interviewed Sonia and Tim Stapleton before the meetings started up. She summarized the concerns and aspirations of each person to really shape the discussions that we had. She planned, coordinated, and facilitated the meetings, and she created the final report of the steering committee process, which is online and is a long, very thorough document. And so next slide, please. So the health working group went through a systematic process to identify experts to sit on the steering committee. We wanted to get experts with a history of scientifically rigorous work, familiarity with oil operations, and other relevant experience. And so the interested candidates completed a survey, and they were scored on the scientific rigor of their work with communities, environmental justice, familiarity with oil operations. And the final three that the health working group selected represented a pretty diverse group in terms of experience, and they were established scientists and researchers, and had a significant body of relevant work. So let's go on to the next slide. So the three experts that were selected, they're down in the left-hand corner there. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. Deborah Bright-Stevens is the principal and president of an organization called Environmental Audit. It's an environmental planning company, and they have expertise in all aspects of planning and land use, environmental analyses, hazardous substances management, remediation, air quality, and health risk assessments. And then the second one was Jill Johnston, who's an assistant professor of preventive medicine at the University of Southern California. She's in the Department of Preventive Medicine in their environmental health program. And she's done a lot of work that has to do with toxic exposures and impacts on communities. And then we also, our third expert was Seth Shonkoff, and he is executive director of PSE Healthy Energy, which is a nonprofit research institute that studies the way energy production and use impact public health and the environment. Okay, so that's a mouthful. We also had our CAP representatives, and we had folks from public health and other agencies, so myself and Carrie Taylor. We had folks from CARB who are going to be doing CARB snaps that you're familiar with. And then we had some folks from SCA QMD, South Coast AQMD. And then we had some folks that sat in who were not part of the committee, but were either observers, either taking notes, which is the Burns & McDonald staff and the Intrinsic staff. It was their subcontractor who helped with the document review and the drafting of the scope of work. And then Tim Stapleton, who used to have Edgar's position in this group. He also sat in on some of the meetings. Next slide, please. So we met 5 times as a steering committee from October 2019 through January 14th. The 5 meetings were focused each on specific topics, and the agendas were designed and facilitated by Jennifer Trotter, who was our facilitator from Burns & McDonald. She gathered input from public health and from the experts to help design the agendas. And the goal was to walk the group through the process of sifting through background information, weighing pros and cons of different ideas, and come to a decision on the final design. So we're going to talk just a little bit more about some of the information that we considered. So go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So the group really waded through an awful lot of information, including the community priorities and concerns, which in addition to the ones that were listed in the letter that we had from April 2018, the community members basically brought their own experience working with the CAP and living in these communities to bear. So the community priorities and concerns were always kind of top of mind. And then we considered information on environmental racism and history of redlining in Los Angeles to define the social justice component. We looked at what makes a scientifically sound study, strengths and limitations of the prior assessments, and also different types of studies that could be done. We looked at important health outcomes, ways to get different types of data, the data sources, what their strengths and limitations were. And that was all designed to get us to the end of the time that we had together to look to the experts for their recommendations on the design of the assessment. Okay, so the next slide, please, gives us the expert recommendations that were made. And so they made 3 general unanimous recommendations. And the first one was to estimate exposure based on residential distance from the oil field. So one of the most difficult issues with doing this type of a study is that we don't have a good way to measure exposure. We can't put like sensors on people's shoulders that they walk around with 24/7 for a year. And so since the last assessment that was done, that was one of the things that we did do, was to look at how other researchers have done this in the intervening years. And they have used different, kind of different iterations of estimating exposure based on residential distance. So what that means is you have a point where someone lives and you can say how much infrastructure, how many oil wells, how many, like what kind of infrastructure is within what distance from that particular house. So each house can get its own measure estimate of exposure. So that, let's see. So that is an improvement over the last assessment in that the method gives us greater geographic specificity. So it's not looking at all the houses within one particular zip code or one particular census tract. It's looking at each house and giving each house a particular measure. Then the second recommendation that they made was to consider doing a household survey and including an easily collected and non-invasive biological measure, something like lung function or blood pressure. And they agreed that it wasn't advisable to do something invasive, like looking for blood markers or urine tests or anything like that. And what this does is it allows us to attach data that we collect in a survey to that residential location. So it's actually, again, it's more specific than looking at things at a quarter-mile increment, which is the recommendation of the CAP. This is actually more specific than that. And if you do a biometric measure, while it might not be a true indicator of X causes Y, it adds strength to findings. So it's a way of compiling evidence that leads to a conclusion. So that was the reasoning behind that. And then the third recommendation that they made was to consider eliminating cancer incidence and mortality rates due to the methodological limitations. And let me be clear on this. This doesn't mean that these are eliminated altogether, because CARB is going to be looking at these. CARB is going to be looking at what's in the air and the health risks associated with it. The reasons that we're not going to look at it in our part of the assessment, or that they recommended not looking at it in our part of the assessment, is that really the data isn't available at the household level. It's not available at the geographic specificity that we need. And so it's really hard to find an association between that outcome and any kind of measure of exposure. In addition, we're looking at a small geographic area, and there's unlikely to be a sufficient number of cases that are of cancers that are related to oil field exposure that can theoretically be connected. And so it comes down to statistical probabilities. We can't even find an association because we don't have enough numbers of cases. They did recommend, however, that we look at birth outcomes due to the advantages of birth data, because you can get birth data at the household level, and there's a 9-month exposure period. And within that 9-month exposure period, there are impacts that you can find. So those are the recommendations that were made by the experts, and they were considered with all the body of information that was provided. Please go to the next slide. So the committee made a recommendation to DPH, made recommendations to DPH that were pretty much in line with the recommendations that the experts made. So the first recommendation is to conduct a household survey with a biological measure to study shorter term self-reported outcomes and to look for differences in outcomes by residential distance from the oil field. And that will give us correlational data that will tell us if there's a relationship. We're still not going to be able to get at anything causal, and that's just a limitation of the studies. That's a limitation of all the studies that we could possibly do. The second recommendation was to study differences in birth outcomes by residential distance from the oil field. And the third recommendation was not to include cancer incidence and mortality in this part of the assessment because of the current methodological limitations. And these recommendations really do address many of the community recommendations that were made in that April 18th letter. Also, it's important to note that not analyzing cancer and mortality data in this round doesn't prevent us from doing so in the future when the methodology might be better, and there might be new methods that are that we're able to study. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so if you're male or, if you're older, you may be saying, why study birth outcomes? Those things don't actually apply to me. And again, it's because we're looking for evidence of an impact, which is the best that we're going to be able to find. We're looking for evidence of health impacts. And if we study birth outcomes, we can get household level data, which is at the specificity we need, the geographic specificity. We can estimate, as other researchers have done. And we also actually have a piece of information that I've never seen used in the literature, which is meteorological data. And that will add to actually the state of studies right now, because we don't have, I haven't seen a study that uses that also in estimating exposure. So that will tell us which neighborhoods are more likely to be impacted. That's one of the things that will tell us which neighborhoods are more likely to be impacted. We can also get, well, let me put it this way. There have been recent studies that have found effects on birth outcomes among those living closer to oil and gas facilities. So your best likelihood for building on previous research is to look at the previous research and try and move it one step forward. And we already talked about the shorter latency time. So the benefit of the survey and the biometric measure, again, it's the household level data. We have flexibilities in the questions that can be asked. So we haven't determined what the survey is going to ask. That will be developed in conjunction with the community. And we can ask about the things like length of time at the residence, short-term health symptoms, and the other risk factors that we weren't able to get at last time, like smoking and physical activity. And then a biometric measure adds strength to any findings. So if we find something, a relationship between self-report and our estimation of exposure, if we find a relationship there, and then we have a biometric measure that also shows a relationship there, that strengthens the findings considerably. So next slide, please. So this takes us to what it is we're asking a contractor to do. So we put out this works order solicitation on February 3rd, and what we're requiring, what DPH is requiring for bidders to come back with is they have to establish and convene, we're calling it a community advisory board to differentiate it from the CAP, except that the purpose of doing this is to make sure that the CAP has kind of the final say on all of these things. So they have to convene this community advisory board in conjunction with the CAP. My vision would be that whatever contractor we hire comes to the CAP and says, okay, How are we going to do this? Do you want this? Do you want us to come to the CAP meetings every week? That might get cumbersome. Do you want to select a group of people that will represent the CAP and that will review all the documents and all the materials and everything? So they have to do this, but how they do it is very much dependent on the CAP's input. In terms of estimating exposure, we're asking them to estimate exposure based on all the relevant data that we have. So distance from the oil wells, the infrastructure, the meteorological data, and any other relevant data that might be available. We don't know that a contractor won't have, they might have some data that's relevant as well. So at a minimum, we need them to be able to estimate from a residence what a relative exposure level is for people that live in that home. And then they're going to do analyze birth outcomes within a 2-mile radius of the Inglewood oil field according to estimated exposure. So look for a relationship between birth outcomes. And that may go back as far as 20 years. So there's a lot of information to collect there. And those data are available from the state by special request. And so the contractor will be tasked with getting those. And then to conduct a household survey, including a biometric measure, which might be lung function as probably the top runner or the front runner right now. And then to analyze those data by estimated exposure. And one of the reasons that we have worked so hard to stay in touch with CARB is because we want these two efforts to intersect, because they're going to be the ones that are doing the measuring what's in the air and looking to do the health risk assessment based on the actual toxics that are in the air. So we anticipate that they're going to be doing, well, we know they're going to be doing mobile monitoring to characterize the air quality in different neighborhoods. So, you know, we can match our data to what they find in those neighborhoods. They're going to provide an understanding of the air emissions in the area in general, which will help us understand basically what everybody's exposed to. And the caveat is that we're going to need to work with the CARB SNAP's timing. So we've tried to build in some flexibility in the work order solicitation in terms of the timing. That is going to be an ongoing challenge. And also, you know, we've had some issues with COVID too. So we're hoping that there's enough flexibility in the timing that we'll be able to make those things match up. So for next steps, bids are due in March, at the end of March. In the month of April, we'll be doing review, selection of the contractor and negotiating contracts. The contract, actually. Our proposed start date is May 3rd. At this point, it's going to depend on, you know, what kind of bids we get and how long it takes us to review them. And then in terms of actually starting the assessment, the first things that the contractor will be doing will be working with the CAP to assemble the advisory group. They will have to get the birth data pretty quickly. They'll have to start drafting protocols, data collection protocols, data analysis protocols, study materials for our review and for the community review. And then they'll have to start working on their, because they're going to be doing, it's going to be human subject study, they'll have to submit to institutional review boards to make sure that the rights of any human subjects are protected. So those are the next steps. And now after that, like, I feel like I flew through that. Thank you. The next slide. I want to open it up for the folks that participated in this process and in creating this presentation to like maybe highlight things I missed or highlight things that I didn't say clearly or just offer their own comments. So I think we're going to start with Erica.
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you. I gave the presentation on environmental justice, and as people pointed out, it was mostly the history of environmental justice and environmental racism. And so I'm just talking about what the city, and I can't speak for the county, but what the city does to prioritize the issue of environmental justice and environmental equity. So the city strives to prioritize services provided based on CalEnviro screen scores. So for example, my office focuses on oil and natural gas, including drill sites, pipelines, and refineries. So it's important to note that many wells, refineries, and pipelines run along under or nearby low-income and or disadvantaged communities, which creates inequities in communities of color. So for example, in Los Angeles, there are 16 active drill sites scattered throughout the city in various neighborhoods. And specifically in August of 2018, we were directed by the Energy, Climate Change, and Environmental Justice Committee to review sites considering the Cal scores. So as we're offering services, we're prioritizing the service for the neighborhoods with higher or worse Cal screen scores. So for example, barring any major incidents, it's going to be South LA and Wilmington's sites that will be prioritized over the ones that are in West Side or South Robertson. And again, that's based on the Cal scores. If there is some mishap that happens, as things do, for example, in Rancho Park, there was a spill of an odorant. And so that was a big effort that, of course, we were working on, and we did a report and follow up on that. So that became a priority. But if things are as needed or going at normal rate, we're going to prioritize the requests that come in through the people who have the most impact. Some newer things that have happened for the city of Los Angeles is that there is a new Civil and Human Rights and Equality Department. And so that was actually formed in 2019. And it predated a lot of what happened in 2020. But in February of 2020, the director was appointed. And this department's role is to investigate Angelenos' complaints of racism, discrimination, unequal treatment related to employment, housing, education, and commerce. And it's also tasked with supporting and advising LA Civil and Human Rights Commission and enforcing the Civil Rights and Human Rights Ordinance. And so that was, again, created prior to everything that happened in June of 2020, but it's receiving a lot more attention. Another thing that happened post 2020 or June 2020, when of course everyone was upset about racial issues, was that the mayor signed Executive Directive 27, and that's for racial equity in city governments. And so that's calling for racial equity officers, racial equity action plans for every department, which affects hiring processes, and a racial equity task force. And so, for example, as we're submitting our budget requests this year, we had to describe how they were in alignment with the department racial equity plan. So that's just some of how the city is using, and maybe that's some of those ideas, or it could be things that the county and the study would use, but we're looking at this data, this historic inequities, and how we can address them moving forward.
Thank you, Erica. Liz, did you have anything you wanted to add? And I don't know if has Paul joined, Edgar?
No, I don't see him on here.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks.
With the addition of this photo, it shows you the efforts are far exceeded, and not just exceeded, but the process followed through by the health department was a fabulous change from the previous health study, because we'd never done one. And I was on that committee with Paul and some other people. And now this time, what was so great was that we took the time to begin by collecting all this data from the community CAP, et cetera, and then getting experts. And, she didn't have the study. If you review it, tells you the length that they went to pick the experts. But it was really great that there was input from everybody in the working group and the steering committee, and then to choose these people, so that there was, and they were suggested by the group, not the group, by the community. So as a result, the people that were chosen, I think, were really, they brought a diverse skill set, all from related to oil and gas, which I thought was fabulous. And it was really wonderful to work with everybody, and it didn't matter where you came from and your background. I think we worked together as a really cohesive group, wanting the best that we could get for the study. And Christine just made an incredible effort to make sure that that was covered. Thank you.
Charles, did you have comments you wanted to make? Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, hi, hello everyone. First of all, I just want to thank Christine. You did a excellent job, not just with this presentation, but also with answering our questions and corralling the group and steering the group to a scientifically valid way of looking at the issue. Sonia, excellent. Coming into this study, I had my concerns, and one of the concerns I expressed to Jennifer was that I wanted to make sure that this study didn't unfairly bias a pro oil field or anti-oil field. And I can say that I'm convinced now that we got a fair treatment of it. The scientific experts that we selected were exceptionally qualified, and they were unbiased, and they gave their honest opinion. And make no mistake, we realize that some of these issues are pertinent, very pertinent to the community. Certainly my community, the community on the east side, struggles with the consequences of these issues on a daily basis. So we wanted to make sure that they did the best possible analysis that they could. And they tried as much to expand the scope of the work, but based on the constraints that the CAP set up, we had to confine it to the Inglewood oil field. So we ended up with a product that the output was scientifically justifiable. So I'm convinced about that. And I'm also convinced that all participants came together and worked to achieve a really great product. Now, the understanding is that everyone may not get the answer that they want. They may not get that, but they will get the scientifically valid results. So we have to prepare ourselves for the outcomes. But so far, I think we've done a great job. Congratulations to everyone, and looking forward to making this project, seeing the completion to this project. Thank you.
And Melanie, thank you, Charles.
Yes, so a couple points to add, and I just want to circle back a little bit to the concept of the settlement agreement. You know, in Christine's presentation, there was quite a bit of reference to you know, the study of incidence of cancer and mortality rates, and the reason behind that is because the settlement agreement sets that guidance as something to be included within this community health assessment and environmental justice study. And so, you know, that was one of several guidelines we used in looking at this. And all the CAP members should have received, and it's posted on site. There's a message that the steering committee has prepared to the CAP and the community, explaining in a little bit more detail why there was a shift in that guidance, and as Christine very clearly laid out. So that's why there was so much discussion on that topic, and we looked at it so thoroughly. And I also kind of want to point out that, you know, having sat through several years worth of CAP meetings and other various meetings on the Inglewood oil field, and listening to the community come forward, especially, and when we talk about health concerns, so many members of the community have come forward and expressed their concerns or their experiences of what they are experiencing in terms of health that they believe are related to the oil field. And I just want to make it really clear that we took all of that information into consideration and tried to figure out how we could, you know, statistically start to document some of that as part of our study. So that was definitely considered in the input that we've received so far from the community. And we made sure that in talking about the design of the study going forward and involving the community, that there'll be additional ways to solicit input on that and to have that input somehow documented in the study, even if we're not able to find causation, that we start to at least use this as a way to collect that information. And then I just wanted to wrap up by saying I feel that, you know, there were some things that we had hoped early on that we would be able to accomplish with the design for this assessment. And whenever we came to a point where it didn't seem like we were going to be able to incorporate what we wanted, I really will point out that the steering committee and the panel of health experts, we did quite a bit of problem solving. You know, when we came across an obstacle, we had very detailed and thorough discussion about, you know, well, could we try this or could we try that? So we really made every attempt to figure out how to approach the study and in a way that
that could be as most inclusive as possible. And having said that, I also am very pleased with the results that we came out of it. And all I can say is that it was very thorough. We tried to keep it very balanced. And I look forward to this next step, moving forward finally to get a consultant on board and actually have the assessment begin to get underway. And thank you, Christine and Sonia, for all your great work on getting us to this point.
Thank you, Melanie. The committee members put in a huge number of hours, huge, just lots and lots and lots. And I just am very impressed with the dedication of the people that sat on the steering committee and the CAP and everybody. And I'm very grateful for that. You can go to the next slide, Edgar. But I want to see if there's time for questions. The next slide has some resources on it if people are interested, the links for things. And then I want to turn it over to the chairs, co-chairs for questions, if there's time.
There's plenty of time. I see we've taken up about 40 something minutes, so we have enough time for questions. I am looking at the Q&A on screen, and so I'll just get that through. And then we can definitely open it up to board members if they have any specific questions. And I just wanted to say the work that was been done, obviously was a lot of commitment from the people involved, and the consultants you have on board, as well as the experts. I know Dr. Jill Johnston and Dr. Joe Ghosh are wonderful people, USC and AQMD, and the rest of them I don't know, but I'm sure if you're that specific about how you look for people, you'll have some good people. The one question that caught my eye in this is, has Trotter and Burns and McDonald worked directly for oil and gas operators? And I believe that's one of the consultants that was on the list.
Right. I don't know for sure. I will need to get that information.
Okay. So that's noted. And then this is also from Mr. Williams or Mrs. Williams, I'm not sure, CT Williams. Met station modeling for exposure requires dense gas model, which would correlate far better with complaints and exposures than a free air model. That sounds like an AQMD question because I know they're doing the air sampling. But I guess we could have Edgar note that and maybe share that with the folks at AQMD.
Will do.
Okay. I think that's the only questions I see online. The information is available at the link that's in the chat, as well as the Q&A, the presentation, and all the information supported for this study or for this group and their output, which is pretty amazing in terms of getting this done during the pandemic and having it track, hopefully with the SNAPS project. I'll let everybody else speak. If any of the CAP members want to say something, please feel free.
Alex Fish.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all the hard work, and thanks for putting it all in context with all the other things going on. It's just it really shows the thoughtfulness and that this was done carefully and well informed. The question I have is sort of broad. I know that I've seen other public health studies with environmental conditions that focus on births, on birth information. I've always wondered, obviously it doesn't tell us any more than information about exposure and birth, but is that why those other studies probably have focused on birth weight, birth health, and that sort of thing, because of the small n problem, the small sample size, or is it its own, is it something that's well understood in public health? I'm trying to understand how this study will sort of stack up against other large headline studies.
Yeah, I see three different issues there. One is our ability to get the birth data at the household level. So to actually be able to look at the health outcomes at a specific home level. And that's not something that you can typically do with cancer rates, because we can't get it at that level. We can only get it for like a zip code. Also, the exposure period for cancer is like 30 years, you know, it's got a long latency period. And so if people have only lived there for 5 years and then they've moved away, or, you know, it's only the people that have lived there for 30 years that you can really study to see if there's any impact. And over those 30 years, conditions will have changed. But with a birth outcome, there's a 9-month exposure period. And that's the in utero period. So that's why it makes the studying of it more, it's like it facilitates it helps with the exposure measure. I'm trying to figure out a better way to say that. Obviously I didn't come up with it. And then what was the third outcome? And you know, birth outcomes are pretty sensitive to environmental exposures in general. So that's another reason why you would do that. So I don't necessarily know how it's going to compare. There have been some studies, and there was that recent study that looked at all of California and found some impacts on birth outcomes, except for urban areas. So this is an urban area. So it's going to be interesting to see how it compares.
It's really helpful. And thank you all again. This just the sensitivity and effort really shows. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Tim Jones.
Thank you, Edgar. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the steering committee, especially for the, I guess I call them cliff notes to this particular report. It's very, very well done, and it explained a lot and helped me understand a lot that apparently has predated my membership, being a part of the panel in the area. So some of my questions pretty much are based on the findings that we're not going to be, the information that we're not going to be able to come up with. Is there, are you at liberty to provide the amount, the budget for this project?
Yes, it's we are putting aside basically $400,000.
How much has been spent thus far?
We spent between $90,000 and $100,000, not of the four. We had a separate pot of money for the scoping phase. So this is in addition to the scoping phase. So of the 400,000, none has been spent.
So where did the 90,000 come from?
That came from Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas's office.
And which bucket of money does that come from?
From his?
Yeah.
Which bucket of his money? I don't know. Sorry, I can find that out.
So that's supervisor, while he was supervisor, or while he's obviously, because he's just become a counselor. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's Mark Ridley Thomas.
I believe it was his discretionary funds, Christine.
Okay. Okay.
We can look at that.
That makes sense.
So is that definite? It's from the discretionary fund, or are you going to look into it?
We have to confirm. I'm almost
Okay.
positive it was the discretionary funds, but we'd have to go back and double check.
Okay. Now with the Burns and McDonald surveying group, did they take in consideration the fact that we are looking at a diverse area, that we've already had the discussion within our CAP meetings that reporting can create a really big difference depending on the demographics of that particular neighborhood? And I say that because my personal belief is that you're going to get a very different compliance when you go east or west of La Cienega Boulevard. So has that been taken into consideration as well?
I would say the way that that's taken into consideration is that for all procedures that are going to be designed to collect data, the whatever contractor we end up hiring is going to have to work with the CAP and community advisors to help work through those issues and design procedures and data collection, like recruitment efforts to get people to participate in the study. It's going to be key. And those procedures haven't really been designed yet.
So what is your current estimate for the survey pool?
That will be based on a power analysis. So the contractor will do the power analysis to determine how many people need to be surveyed, how many households.
Is there acceptable level of, in order to accept the report, will there be an acceptable level of return of the information? For example, if there's 100,000 people, we only get 50,000 responses. Are there some controls to the overall survey?
Yeah, there will be. And again, that's going to be statistical power. It doesn't make sense to collect data unless you have the statistical power to find things so you do calculations to see how many households you need to have in a survey. And if they can do a calculation and shows that X number of households is what it takes, and then they will be allowed to go forward with those plans.
There's two more really short questions. Has the group, the steering committee, and or the experts determined on what the messaging will be as we roll out this project?
Not yet. That will be part of the planning process for the actual data collection. So when they're talking about developing materials, recruitment materials, or procedures, that is something that I hope the community can weigh in on, or is willing to weigh in on, because there's no one that's going to come from the outside knowing as much about the community as the people in this group do. So I fully intend for the contractors to consult with this group.
And the only reason that I bring that up is that the whole privacy issue, especially in a minority area, to divulge health information,
Right.
Extremely suspicious that this information is going to be devolved into increasing insurance rates, or perhaps not allowing health insurance at all, because we're in an area that ultimately is one that has a higher incidence of either birth defects or stillbirths or something to that effect. So,
those are really, really good points. Messaging is going to be really important. You're right.
And the last thing is, during the CAP meeting, we've had discussion about the meteorological data that we received. Albeit some of that discussion was inconsistent with wind direction and ultimately what we can truly expect to find as far as some of the contaminants. Will those issues be cleared up prior to incorporating that type of data within the overall report, which you actually pointed out was something that may not be a part of any other report, that might be something that is helpful to ours?
You know, that's a good question. And I'm not sure that I can answer it at this point. Probably would need input from someone from, someone who knows more about the actual science of that. I'm better with the survey stuff. So, we will have folks like CARB working with us on this, and we're going to have to probably contact the air experts, like consult the air experts on things like that. It's not my area of expertise, but I hear what you're saying, and I do think it's an issue that's going to need to be brought up in the planning process before the data analyses start.
Thanks for all your hard work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Those were really good
one more
questions.
Deborah?
Yeah. Hi. Can you hear me, folks? I think you can.
Yes.
Yes. First of all, a million thanks, Christine. That was a brilliant presentation, and a big, huge thanks to everybody on the steering committee and everybody who's raising such wonderful questions. I just want to circle back to something that you said during your presentation, and that is that you will not be looking, or this study will not be looking at the incidence of cancer vis-a-vis the proximity to the oil fields. And I would ask, please, that there maybe be some reconsideration of that point, because I do live in a cancer cluster adjacent to the oil fields. I'm not the only one who's a cancer survivor, and there were many cancer victims. And I know that this is a very dicey topic and requires, as you point out, there were some methodological limitations, but I think it is a problem that needs to be considered, and the findings need to be determined as best as possible, even if there are restrictions and limitations on the methodology.
I hear what you're saying. The issue is that it's really not even just the limitations on the methodology. It's that it's really, we don't have the methodology to do a study that would be funded. And so, for example, you know, when you have scarce dollars to put into a study, you really need to try and do the things that are going to be most likely to be able to answer questions. And my fear, and you know, along with the experts, is that we could do the study and not be able to answer the question still. And so,
well, can I jump in here for 1 second?
Sure.
In terms of a cost-effective manner idea, and that is when you're talking about doing a household survey, I was going to say simply add, but it's not so simple. Add some questions, health-related questions, focused on respiratory problems and cancer. Now, there are going to be people who are going to be squeamish and not want to answer those questions. Right. I get it. They're privacy issues, and it's very personal, and having cancer is very traumatic. But we do also have higher rates of, or very high rates of asthma in this same area where we have the cancer cluster. Now, this is one area. I'm aware that there are many areas that are adjacent to the oil fields and need to be considered. But again, I think that it can be done in a cost-effective manner to get at least some basic information from the people who are completing the surveys.
I don't disagree with that. I will tell you, though, there's a lot of links that have to go into that, and there have been no decisions made on the actual questions that will be in the survey. So that is something that you can continue to advocate for. Some of the drawbacks of that are that it's really hard to know which cancers are the ones that would likely to be caused by exposure to an oil field. So that's—
Well, there's research that reflects reproductive cancer, which bears into and is linked to birth outcomes. So the reproductive organs are one set where the reports I've read are affected by the potential toxins, allegedly. Now there are causation issues, yes, but I don't think we have to get into the legality of that. So again, I think that the survey would be great, and I think the outcome of the report is going to be fabulous. But if we miss the boat on these issues that I've just raised, it's not going to be as complete as I think we'd like it to be.
I think, Christine, if I could just put in my 2 cents, and this is a total layman's, not a scientist, not at all. I think that the big issue that the experts sort of impressed, and I wasn't in the room, so I can't speak for what happened, but what I'm understanding of what happened is that it's really about the cancer registry rates, right? Like that data, just for whatever reason, they don't get that isn't collected or isn't presented at the household level. So they're not going to be able to make that causation. So they could spend time reviewing that data, but it's going to be the same issue we had in the first one. I think that definitely, as the health working group with the CAP, and we'll really want to press upon the design of this community advisory board in a way that it represents the community, that we have all the, you could be on the CAP, other people can, to make sure that these issues are raised and that we have a good discussion of how do we ask these questions in a way that people are comfortable answering, but also understanding that if we don't get enough people to answer all of these questions, we still may not get enough information that we need. So we have to be very clear that we get the right information, the right types of questions in the survey, that it's not too evasive, that it's not too long, so that people feel comfortable. I mean, we may also want to consider, making recommendations like for other funding, for focus group, for other ways that we can supplement this study. And again, remembering that this study is part of a bigger process that we need to impress upon our elected officials, that they need to continue to fund this kind of information, or fund these kinds of studies, so we can continue to add to it.
I think that's a good conversation, and this is our shot to do something substantive. And $400,000 is a good amount of money to get a study done that's going to have an outcome to point to, versus a windmill that is elusive. So I think that's kind of where we're at. It's a very pragmatic approach, and I appreciate the thought that's gone into it in the discussion. In terms of turning this into the public. Certainly the CAP has a role moving forward as a whole, and this larger community panel will have a role, and outreach becomes the next major component of this, I suppose. So working with the homeowners associations and other groups in and around the neighborhood, even though we're on a virtual platform, I think that can still take place. And I think the timeline you had, kind of goes through the next 8 months or so, right?
Well, okay, so the timeline has, it's also a victim of COVID. So at this point, the earliest this would be done is going to be, I want to say June 2022, with the opportunity to extend to December 2022.
And just to be clear, the funding doesn't run out. It
No.
just goes around. And the AQMD thing is still kind of,
you mean
on the
CARB?
same trajectory. It's on the same timeline trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, still that's going to be the tricky part, is trying to match up the timing with that. Theirs may take longer. So, we may get to the end of our funding before they've got their data. So we're going to have to work with them to be able to gather data, what data we can while they're, going along. We're going to have to figure out how to do that.
Well, we'll keep checking in. And once again, the work that you guys have done to date, this check-in was a very good check-in in terms of, where we are from where we were. So it's very much appreciated. I think we've covered all the conversation on the panel.
Not quite.
Who am I missing?
This is Tim. I'm sorry I don't mean to beat this dead horse, but in the line of trying to remain practical about this, and I believe it was the community person, Debbie, that was asking about the cancer. Mm-hmm. Practicality. If we are engaging with residents in a survey, to have a question that simply states, have you or anyone in your family experienced cancer? Yes, no, or not answer. To have that, even if it's inconclusive as to what type of cancer they may have experienced, that strikes me as an opportunity to at least get additional data, so that perhaps there can be a follow-up study by another nonprofit group or another community group that now has more to go on based on the information that we were able to provide in this funded project. I think we're missing an opportunity to simply put one question that says, have you experienced, anyone in the family experienced cancer? Yes, no, or I don't want to have.
Well, so we haven't missed that opportunity yet. And like Sonia was saying, we still have to decide what's going to be asked on the survey. I don't think, okay, so I will just say you need to make sure that everything you answer is going to result in usable information. And that's what I would say about that.
I agree.
Yeah.
All right. So, we have the opportunity to collect data or not collect data on certain things. And yes, the dance card will be placed with things that will have substantive results. So we'll leave it at that.
If you live in
It's Deborah, can I just jump in with one other comment?
One last comment, because we're going to move on to the rest of the agenda.
Sure. Real quick. When I was diagnosed with cancer, I asked my oncologist, do you think it could be possibly related to genetics, blah, 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 blah. And at the very end of the list, I said, do you think it could be environmental? To which she said, yes. But she also said something else. She said, you're one of the few people who's ever asked, and I see hundreds of cancer patients all the time. Why do I bring this up? Because this assessment affects people of lower income, people who don't speak up, people of color primarily, and maybe they're too shy, or there could be a whole variety of reasons that they don't ask the questions. And that's our job, to ask these questions to protect them as well as everybody else living around the oil fields. And I would think it's in everybody's interest to get the answers to those questions, or at least some data that could be crunched and presented in a usable fashion, because we are the voices of thousands of people who do not speak up, or don't know how to speak up, or are afraid to speak up, but nevertheless have been afflicted with diseases like cancer, asthma, and other problems that may or may not be related to the proximity of their residence to the oil field.
My last comment, if that question cannot be added to this survey, please let me know why.
Thank you.
I would say then, Tim, you should be a part of the community advisory board so that you can make sure that that your question is part, or that you understand the reason why. Again, nothing has been designed. This is our opportunity to come together as a community to make sure that we're represented and that we can answer the questions, and working with the scientists to make sure that we ask the questions in a way that really gets us the data that we need, and we don't do what always gets done in our community. People come and ask us questions and they don't know how to then turn around and say this correlates with A, B, or C, because they didn't ask us the question correctly. That's I think the point that I want to make.
We'll get the questions, and I think we're all on the same page in terms of who we're advocating for and the situation we're trying to get a grip on and get our arms around. So I appreciate everyone's comments, and we will, with that, move back to the agenda items. Let's go to item D, Regional Planning ECC update. From the periodic review #2 update. I think that's going to be on you, Edgar.
Yeah, it's me, Luis, and Dean. So still working on final details, working with our management on direction for everything. I'll hand over to Dean and Luis, see if they have anything to add to that.
No, I think we mentioned at the last meeting that we have draft language on the periodic review that to be included as to how to modify the annual drilling plan to ensure that there will be additional mitigation considered for those annual drilling plans where the applicant chooses to exceed the 25 wells. And so that's the kind of language that we're putting into as a recommendation in the periodic review report. And then we're providing that report, and then we have to go through the process of scheduling the hearing with the hearing officer and so on. And I think we believe that this can happen within the next 3 months.
Any questions on that? Okay, if we don't have any questions, we can move on to the next portion of our next item for regional planning is the 2020 ground movement survey for production year 2019-2020. Just provided to everyone in the email sent out with the agenda. As everyone knows, this was a little bit of a longer production year for this survey, given COVID. It was extended to 18 months. Let's see, I don't know if Luis or Dean, you want to add on to anything from the report?
Well, I think it's a very comprehensive report. I think you all have had a chance to look at it. Obviously, if people have questions, we'd be happy to try to answer them. Some of the findings of the report include that there was no changes beyond the threshold within the findings of the report. The INSAR, the satellite data, did show 3 different locations where there were exceedances, and this is sort of an additional report that the operator chooses to do that provides some additional information. But what we're seeing, and in reading all these reports, I think that what you're able to garner is that the movements within the oil field for both subsidence and uplift are relatively small in the scheme of things. And you also get a really interesting perspective looking back and reading some of these reports where they mentioned that before they were doing any type of the water flood and replenishing and balancing the oil field, they were seeing subsidence, that was a few feet or so. So if anything, it shows that the management of the field, when we're seeing, some uplift or subsidence that is below the threshold, we see that that is a very small amount in comparison to that, and it basically shows that the management of reinjection of fluids into the reservoir is being effective in controlling how the subsidence could happen in the field. Then I don't know if people have questions on the reports themselves.
There's 2 things, and since I have you, Luis, I think there was a question in the chat box with regards to the item prior, the periodic review, and there was a question of whether there'll be some sort of public hearing or comment period once that's released. I just wanted to bring that up real quick.
Yes, it will be. We're, like I mentioned, our estimated timeline will be 2 to 3 months to get to hearing. There would be a period for commenting, and the hearing as well as available. It's public as well. So
okay.
Once everything's ready, we'll send notifications out and opportunity to comment.
And that was a dog barking twice saying yes. Okay. So let's see. Luis, I think I appreciate your comments. In terms of this ground movement survey, what I do understand is that the injections are balancing the subsidence and uplift, or at least that's what the philosophy is. The numbers are being held using the injection process. So we are dependent on the oil operator for those reinjections to maintain some stable level of subsidence and uplift. And I don't know if that's outside of pre-production, but now in this year, in these years, while there is oil production, we are dependent on that to manage the subsidence and uplift, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
That is correct. And,
okay.
And yeah, one last minor point that I forgot to make is that one of the things that we're finding as we look at the results from previous years is that there is no discernible pattern where you can say, gee, this is always uplifting, or gee, this is always subsiding. We find that in some cases, certain areas are subsiding some years and then uplifting in others. And it's just sort of interesting, just sort of as a side note.
And so just my layman's look at this thing, and I've been looking at them for a number of years. This was an 18 months, so it wasn't just 2019, 2020. This was different. It went a little bit further back into the year prior, correct? And station 110, 117, and 134 each had uplift and subsidence. I think these are all uplift. This is all up this year in this study. 1.2 inches in one, 0.89 inches another, and 1.0 inches. And this is based on the executive summary from SOMAS, I believe. So I understand that this is 1 year, I believe. Oh, this is during the 2017 to 2020 period. So I guess my only question, and this is just, just to get clarification, there's an average, and that's the threshold we're trying to make sure we meet, versus movement that goes above that, but in a certain period. And these numbers on page 3 of the executive summary from SOMAS on those three monuments, I guess just explain that to me, why they aren't above the threshold.
Luis, can I answer that?
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, what happened, David, was that when SOMAS did it, the experts decided to go back to 2017. SOMAS did that study, and they did this year's study, and we had used a different surveyor for the 2 years between. And the SOMAS uses a different reference than the other surveyor, so the data doesn't really line up very smoothly. There's a kind of a step down and then a step back up. So the experts decided they would compare all of the data this year to the last SOMAS survey, which was 2017. So if SOMAS, their role in this is to do the surveying. Their role is not to evaluate. So they didn't want to start making some calculations or some evaluation of what the average movement was in a year. So they just said, okay, for the last 3 years, this monument has moved a total of 1 inch in 3 years. The average would be roughly 1/3 of an inch, per year. And that's when the comment comes, 1/3 of an inch per year average is below the threshold. The 1 inch happens to be above the 0.6, but that would be over a 3-year period. And that's where the difference comes in. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, and I was trying to make sure that it was like, okay, if it's kind of confusing for me, then I would try and share that question with the panel. And I think as long as the CSD is looking at average,
yeah,
and what the language is in the thing, then I have no problem.
Yeah, and I don't know, the CSD probably doesn't really have specific language for this instance. I mean, the language really does, contemplate you're doing this survey every year. And so this is a little bit of a different year. And the experts, they kind of made a judgment call on how best to evaluate the data. So the only thing that it really triggers is that for all the property damage complaints that we get, it dictates whether or not we have to evaluate them. We evaluate them all regardless of whether the monuments exceeded the threshold or not on a given year. So from that standpoint, it doesn't have really any material impact on how property damage claims are evaluated.
Okay. And the only other thing, just inquiring minds want to know, there's always a discussion about the in the boundaries of the CS. Well, I don't know if it's in the boundaries of CSD or in the boundaries. One's outside the CSD boundaries and one's inside the CSD boundaries. And as I understand it, the CSD boundaries, is that the imprint of the oil field active surface or sub? I mean, I've been here for a long time and I keep thinking about the CSD boundaries. I see that big map and I see the little square over it. I'm like, but how is that the boundaries when, it might be subsidence on La Cienega and Obama?
I'm gonna try and explain this. Let me see if, Edgar, is it okay if I share my screen?
Edgar?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, let's see if I'm
and Dan's going to share his screen. You're a dangerous man. Let's see.
Well, I do this, David, very reluctantly. What Dan is referring to this blue outline here, and someone who was in the original CSD needs to explain this little rectangle outside of it. This is the official boundary of the CSD, and it includes the cemetery and a majority of the field that's productive at this point. And that's one boundary. The green, I believe, is the Dogger boundary, it's CalGEM now. But if you go to the CalGEM databases, you'll see the green as being the official Inglewood oil field boundary, which is different. And David brought up a third possibility, and that was what's the active oil field right now. And I would say we don't have, that boundary doesn't appear here, but it would be inside the blue. It would be roughly, if you guys can see my cursor, I'm not sure if you can, but roughly inside the blue line without, excluding the cemetery would be where all the active wells are today. So there's really kind of 3 different boundaries that you could view when you talk about that.
Okay. It's fascinating because, there's a whole discussion about the Vicar Wren's sands, which is, like you said, the most active part of the field at this point in time, right?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, learning is growing, I suppose. All right. Any other questions on the CSD ground movement?
Yeah, this is Tim. Dan, Luis, thank you so much for making the report understandable to even a non-petrochemical engineer like myself. I really appreciate that. Couple questions for you. On the re-injection, where does the water come from that you're re-injecting? Because as Luis pointed out, right now it appears that with the measurements you've taken, we've got an inverted donut. And I realize that the ground changes. It's a very dynamic and fluid scenario. But I'm really curious as to where the re-injection substrate comes from, and because I know that you're doing that.
All of the water that we produce, Tim, gets re-injected. And as David said, the Vickers Ridge is really where water flood occurs. That's the a shallow zone that's the most productive. But we inject the water even that we produce from the deeper sands. It's not a great volume, but it is some volume. And then we process water from an urban site also, and that gets re-injected. And so we're able to maintain, let's call it 100% replacement. We basically replace what we produce with that extra water. That extra water replaces the oil that we take out and sell. And that's how we maintain 100%.
Dan, and that was, I was hoping that was the case. Now, aren't we also in an area where there's an aquifer where we're literally replacing, I guess you would call it groundwater that's actually been filtered with urban water that's being re-injected that's not filtered through the substrate that's there?
Oh, Tim, I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm sorry.
So in that particular area, the oil field area, is there a natural aquifer in that area as well?
When you refer to aquifer, are you referring to drinking water, or are you referring to something else?
Drinking water.
No, sir. We don't really do anything with drinking water. Nothing. Everything we do would be brine that's produced, from reservoirs that have oil.
Okay. Okay. I'll leave it there. Apparently, I've got to reframe it. One last question though. When we were looking at some of the other slides, I think it was from last meeting, we looked at some of the contaminants that were airborne. I believe one of them was chromium-3. And I was curious as to whether or not that chromium was reduced to something that was less carcinogenic, like a chromium-2, based on the fact that we have a community garden that's in proximity.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, Tim. I'll have to go back to I'll have to get those slides and take a look. I'm drawing a blank right now. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I'll pull one up as well, and I'll try and send it over to you.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
All right.
Yeah, and you may be referring to the health risk assessment, Tim. Is that perhaps what we're talking about?
Well, I hope so, Luis.
Right. That was from the last meeting that we had, and I'd forgotten to bring that up only because, again, as we go over and pick fruit from the community garden, whether or not any of the fruits, any of the vegetables and fruits over there had ever been tested for carcinogens or foreign materials that may have been sent there inadvertently.
I'm not sure exactly what the reference is, but if you can send it to Edgar, we can look into it. Okay. The one thing I can refer you back to is that the findings for the health risk assessment during 2019, when there is no drilling going on, is that the emissions from the oil field, the modeled emissions and actual emissions that are used for that model that we ran for the health risk assessment, are way below the threshold for cancer risk and all the other things. So we do know that based on the models that we ran, that the health risk assessment showed that there was no impact. So there shouldn't be any resulting impact on some neighboring garden or anything like that.
Well, someone was chiming in with a follow-up to that, and I'm not going to take up the additional time right now, but I will go back and check.
Let us know what the reference is, and we'll look at it.
Appreciate it.
Okay. Any more questions?
Liz Gosnell has a question.
Liz has a question.
Hi. I just want to confirm with Dean and Luis that when Dan Tamuti was talking about the water and re-injecting, et cetera, it's my understanding that he is talking about geologic, ancient ocean water that's mixed with oil way down where the oil is. This is not the water we drink, and it is not the aquifer. Is that accurate?
Yeah, Liz, you're absolutely right.
Okay, and
That's
I think
correct.
that is something, Tim, that everybody needs to, they need to start, instead of just saying, oh, we're re-injecting and pulling out water, it is ancient seawater that's mixed with oil at this field, where in other places where they drill oil, it is actually affecting aquifers and drinking water. So, because that's how we constantly have, and Dan, you may go a little more thoroughly into this so people follow. When you do water testing and you have the ponds where you catch water and stuff, and there is no water there, Dean and Luis, correct? So there is no.
Let's just back up for a minute. I think it's important to note, and I don't want to characterize other oil fields as to what they're doing with regards to aquifers or not. Oil production in immature fields such as Baldwin Hills is one where the majority of the production is water. And the way that the operator produces water today, as opposed to what they may have been doing 50 years ago, is they mostly produce 95% plus water when they produce their oil. So in that reservoir, the majority of what they produce is water. And in fact, water is the system that they use to produce the oil that they produce. So if you think about it, for producing 5,000 barrels of oil per day, they're also producing about 95,000 barrels of water. Those same 95,000 barrels of water that are produced are then put through a water treatment facility, and then that water plus additional water that comes from another facility that the operator has is re-injected back in the field. So if you think about how you have a deficit of about 5,000 per day, that's where that deficit comes from, because their re-injection levels are slightly over 100%. So they re-inject more than the total volume of fluids that are extracted from the reservoir each day. And if you want to think about that produced water, one of the, it's a very briny water, and in fact, it gets cleaned up better than the way it was when it came from the reservoir when it gets put back in. Another important thing to consider is that those same molecules of water have been used multiple times, and if you were able to track a molecule of water, I think you would see that same molecule of water probably not every day, Dan, but I would say, but within a week or so, you would see that same molecule of water being used and reused in that oil field.
Oh, we joke about recycling, Luis. Absolutely. No doubt about that.
You guys are tracking molecules. This is funny.
I hope that helps, but it's what happens at that oil field as a result of it being such an advanced aged oil field. It's mostly a water production facility, and it so happens that area, that Vickers area, has a lot of that produced water in train with the oil.
There's a question in the chat room I can answer real quickly, hopefully, unless there's a follow-up. But the question is, what type of techniques are used in the Inglewood field to produce the oil? And it's water flooding is the answer to the question.
So we've kind of learned a little bit more than we knew before. I mean, if you haven't known about the brine water, and I think the end all, trajectory on this is, A, we're not taking any potable water and putting it in. That's not being done. And B, I think I think where Mr. Jones was going, I may be wrong, was, is the re-injection, does that have any possibility of intruding into any freshwater aquifers? And I think we have had that discussion in terms of how the field is structured. And we don't really know, but I don't think there's a major concern of that happening. Correct, Louise?
Well,
that is correct. I think there's a perched aquifer within the oil field that, and in fact we do know, David, because the geology is well known, and it's well known through just all the drilling that has gone on that site. Through all the drilling and coring that you do as you're going through the earth, you're able to really understand the geology of the site, probably better understood than most areas.
Because you're poking all the holes in it, right? Yes.
Yeah, and I want to, Luis, if I can add, we also go to great lengths. CalGEM makes us run tracer surveys in our water injection wells to make sure that the water's not working its way behind pipe and into the freshwater zones. And they make us run what they call surface annular pressure tests, SAPT tests, to make sure that we're not injecting above the frac gradient. So those are regulatory requirements that are on record and all that. And we go to great lengths to make sure that the water that we're re-injecting goes back into the oil zones and nowhere else.
Well, also keep in mind that the groundwater testing program is specifically designed to check for contaminants that would have the potential to get into that perched water body. And so we have 10 years of testing, and we continue to do that as well. And it's a CST requirement to check for potential pollution into that groundwater perched perched body of water. So we are checking. It is being confirmed.
So those are the redundancies that are there to try and make sure that groundwater is safe. And I don't know if that helps Tim or not, but
Actually, it does. It helps a lot. And Dean, thank you so much for adding that. As you point out, potential. We're just trying to stay safe. If the possibility is not zero, then so be it.
So be it. Okay, we're doing good. We got through that, Mayor, but Councilmember Fitch. I'll get it right. Mayor
Mr.
Fitch.
is fine. Mr. is fine. Quick one. Thank you very much for that. It's really helpful. Crosses off some questions I had. And I missed this, I apologize, but the key question, I get that the oil's entrained with produced water and that you re-inject the produced water to keep your pressure. What I didn't catch was what replaces the 5% of extracted oil. Did I hear that comes from West Basin reclaimed water, or what is the source of that water?
It comes from urban sites, sir.
Is this the tap, or is it reclaimed water?
No, it's produced water from another oil field facility.
What? Okay, so
Packard and San Vicente, if you need to know the field names.
San Vicente.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And we're working on recycled water. West Basin wants to sell Sentinel Peak and Baldwin Hills and LA County and the cemeteries recycled water soon. I know the Inglewood oil field is retrofitted for purple pipe as a condition of the CSD. So water reliability is on the forefront, and I think you're the only ones outfitted for that at this moment, but we're trying to get the purple pipe up here, and we'd like the support from Sentinel Peak.
Where does San Vicente get the water that we take from them?
It's produced water, Tim.
I'm sorry?
Same kind of thing. They have an oil field that produces oil and produces a substantial amount of water with it.
I know, but Dan says we take the 5% that we use in our oil field, so that means that they're at a negative of 5%, so they've got to get water from somebody else.
Well, they don't subside. I mean, not all reservoirs subside. Some of them have enough mechanical integrity that it's not an issue.
Okay.
So
Peter stealing from Paul. Okay.
One man's trash is another man's treasure. All right. Where are we at next? We're done with the regional planning update. We are looking at the operator update. Dan, I think you're not going to get off the spot for a few more minutes here.
Hey.
Oh no, David. I delegated this one, man. I'm out of this. Joe Walters is going to handle it.
We got Joseph. Is Joseph doing it?
Yeah, it's Joe. You can call
right,
me Joe. Yeah, I guess I finally get to talk. But anyhow, so for the past month, we've had 3 maintenance rigs in the field operating on average. And in February, we also abandoned 2 oil wells, and we're forecasted to do 12 this year. So that's 2 out of the 12. And by the way, on those maintenance rigs, Deborah, you brought up the White Tower, I think, on the west side of the site, and that was one of them. It was a maintenance rig that was over there. Also, Christine, I think you also asked about the what's going on over there near Stalker Road and La Cienega. And basically, Southern California Edison is doing some line work and also installing a transformer, I think, over at that location. So that's what was going on with all that activity, I think, yesterday and the day before and so forth. In regards to, I think there was some follow-up to some of the complaints from last time in terms of the belt slippage and the maintenance that we do. And these are for 2 wells that were over there on our Stalker location. In any case, what we do in terms of follow-up is at least 2 times a day. The operators go by there and they visually assess these, but also on an annual basis, we do routine maintenance on all those wells. So they're on a schedule. The other thing, let's see. The other thing, I think you guys also wanted to take a look at the location of the biofarm, and I've got a picture. If you want me to bring that up, I can share my screen.
Edgar, can you make that so?
Yeah, go ahead. You should be able to.
Let's see. Yeah, let's see. I'm not sure which one to bring up. Let's see. What do you guys see?
You're getting close.
Yeah.
Your Zoom page.
Oh, you had it there a minute ago.
Yeah, here. Let me just bring this on over and get rid of. I see this. You guys don't see that. Let's see.
There it is. Don't do anything. That's it.
Okay.
Freeze.
Okay, there we go. But see, basically right here is what we have in green, and the blue outline is the biofarm there. So here's La Cienega.
You might point out the guard shack, Joe. It's Stalker and Fairfax.
Yeah,
right there.
Here's Stalker Road, and here's where the guard shack is, Stalker Road. And then here's South Fairfax Avenue, La Brea. So that's kind of in relation to it. It's about, I'd say it's about 1,000 feet into the site from Stalker Road and South Fairfax, right here near the guard shack. And that's basically it. It's about 110,000 square foot of area that we treat soils on. That's the total. So
I'm just going to tell you Stalker Street, and thank you for showing us.
Yeah, you got it. Let me see. I'm going through the list here. The other thing too is in terms of an update on the soil gas and so forth. We have excavated out a couple of areas, a couple of wells where we had the higher concentrations in. One was LAI 1-166 and actually excavated all the way down to the wellhead. Now, this is in a former biofarm area, and the wellhead's about 25 feet below ground surface at this point. But we're in the process of assessing that along with some other areas. So we're actively, looking at all this. I don't know, Dean, is there anything else you wanted to input on this?
Just that the last visit I did, we did visit all the sites that had the elevated readings with the gas monitor, and we did check for, any off-gassing, and we didn't get any results back. You might also mention that as we went through it last week, that four causes were identified as pipelines, and those pipelines have been repaired. So as we're working through each site, we're trying to determine the cause and then further, remedy it as we go through them.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. That's all I got. I think that's it.
I mean, look, John Keekley, isn't there usually a complaint log or something that happens now?
No.
That's every 3 months.
Can I ask a quick question right here?
Yes, please.
You said pipeline repair. I thought this pipeline was steel. I mean, what damages the pipeline? I mean, do you do any troubleshooting as to what could damage a stainless steel pipeline with concrete around it?
Well, first off, they're field lines, so there's not necessarily concrete around them.
Okay.
But what causes them to leak is corrosion. and we're, as part of our investigation, we're going through their pipeline maintenance program, and we're trying to identify the particular pipelines that had issues and where they're at on their maintenance. And all of the pipelines are subject to CalGEM regulations for testing frequency. And we've got the spreadsheet that tracks all these things, and they check wall thickness, and then they calculate a fit for
This is
service
part of your
lifetime.
aging. This is part of your aging pipeline program.
Part of the pipeline maintenance program.
Okay.
If you want to call it aging pipeline, that's fine as well, I suppose.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to focus on the pipelines within the Inglewood oil field that are susceptible to the leakage that you've decided. That, in other words, presumably they've passed the pressure testing that you did before, and they're so. How good is your predictive model for the next pipeline that's going to be leaking, or should we just be replacing pipelines beyond a certain age?
Well, those are all assessed on a certain routine basis too, and we have to follow the CalGEM requirements for doing so. So they are, and part of that testing also involves looking at, well, what's the forecast for the length of time that this pipeline is going to last. So we have to basically assess that and report that information as well.
Can you share what the increments are we're talking about here in terms of CalGEM requirements? Increments of time?
How about if we do a short discussion on that next month?
Yeah. Because
it will take more than the time we have. Well, not more, but we'd have to pull up the pipeline management plan. That's what I've been reviewing lately the past 2 weeks. So I could, with Joe's help, maybe we could do a quick presentation next month.
Yeah.
There's different pipelines have different requirements, and we could go to how they calculate the length of time that a pipeline is estimated to live, essentially. And, they look at the wall loss over time. And if a pipeline has, once it reaches a certain thickness, it has to be replaced. And based on the annual loss of thickness of that pipeline, that's how they calculate the length of service that line can be in. But we can get into it a little bit more if we have a little more time.
Looking forward to it, Dean. Looking forward to it. And also,
yeah, it's all CalGEM stuff. So it's
yeah.
very straightforward. It's all required by CalGEM. And like I said, they have, I don't know, Joe, how many pipelines are in that spreadsheet that we've been looking at?
Okay. And I'm also going to ask my usual question: risk assessment,
There's a lot of
failure mode evaluation. Okay.
Yeah. One last thing to mention too is CalGEM has done a complete inspection of all of our oil wells. That is, they finished up yesterday. It's taken a period of time due to COVID and so forth, but they've looked at every one of them. So we've had a full inspection for CalGEM on all of our oil wells.
So that's a part of the presentation in the pipelines, or maybe later on. We'll put it all in nice.
That's a side note in that regard.
Okay. All right. More information is always good, though. It's always appreciated. So the more you can show your work, the happier everybody is, or at least the more we can sleep better at night. All right. I think we've covered the operator update, and we can move on to our approval of minutes, item H.
David, can I jump in real quick? There was one more question in the chat room I think I can pick off.
Get it.
The question was, are the rigs doing rework on the wells or some other process? And it's not the rigs that Joe referred to are not doing rework as defined by the CSD. It's general maintenance work in which they replace a pump that's worn out or rods that may have parted. So it's not really rework. We'll classify that, Monica, as maintenance. I'm done. I'm going to go on mute for the rest of the meeting.
We don't have to, but we'll move on to our next item, which I said was the approval of the minutes. Has everybody got a chance to look at the minutes that Edgar posted and read through them for any accuracy or mistakes, or actually say that they're perfect? That's fine. I'll give you a few seconds and count down to 10, and then after that we'll just do by unanimous consent that these minutes are approved. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Minutes approved. I think we have announcements and public comment. I'm sorry, let's do public comment. If there is any public comment, burning issues that we need to talk about tonight before we adjourn, we're open for business for a few more minutes. Edgar, you see anything?
Don't see nothing. No hands, no raised hands.
Make sure you're reading and your eyes are open.
Good to go. No comments.
Okay, they've had enough of us. Seeing there's no questions from the public, we'll go straight to adjournment or announcements from the CAP. Does anybody on the CAP have any announcements or something they'd like to share? We're looking good. All right, everyone. I think
well done, David.
Hey, John, where are you?
Phoenix.
Phoenix, Arizona. You going to see some baseball?
No, just hiking.
Okay. All right, everyone. You guys take care. We'll see you next, what is it? The March 20 something? March 23rd.
Bye, everyone.
All right.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.